Morning light on March 18th, 1925, came thin and gray over the Ozark Hills, the kind of light that promises rain but gives no warning of ruin. In farm kitchens across the southeast corner of Missouri, coffee steamed, stovepipes ticked, and men watched a sky that felt heavy but familiar. By early afternoon, a smear of darkness had taken a shape. It did not lift like a storm cloud or march like a squall line. It ran, low, wide, and fast, dragging the horizon behind it. In the minutes before it arrived, the wind went slack, chickens flattened themselves under porches, and the air held the dust of distant fields as if the land itself were holding its breath. Just before 1 p.m., a violent funnel touched down near Ellington, Missouri, and began a sprint that no one had seen before or since. It was not the rope or stovepipe of a picture postcard. Witnesses said it looked like a rolling wall, a smear of soil and smoke so broad that the sky seemed to have fallen. It crossed ridges without slowing, swallowed fences, twisted rail lines into heaps, and ran east-northeast as if it had a destination. Gorham went first, then tiny hamlets with names scarcely marked on a map. Houses burst apart. Barns became kindling that flew like spears. People who lived through it later said the air tasted of iron and damp wood, and that the sound was not a freight train, but several trains, stacked and running. Across the Mississippi into southern Illinois, the thing gathered speed. The town of Murfreesboro heard it before it saw it, a bass roar that shook windows. Then the world turned sideways. Brick storefronts on Walnut Street folded like books closing. A coal tipple collapsed. Passenger cars were tossed off rails. In a school where children had just settled after lunch, the roof lifted and the walls unzipped. Teachers threw their bodies over students and learned how long 10 seconds can be. West Frankfort suffered next, mines coughing dust into a sky already black. Parrish vanished so completely that survivors pointed to open fields and said that was where the town used to be. In DeSoto, the storm tore into the schoolhouse and left a pile of lumber and small shoes. The tri-state tornado, no one called it that yet, ran as if time were after it. Its forward speed reached highway pace for the day, near 70 miles an hour. The path on the ground stayed fat and cruel, a corridor often a mile wide and in places more. You could stand on one rise and see nothing but leveled timber and scattered farmsteads from edge to edge, the way a mower leaves a swath through high grass. The barometer in one parlor fell so fast the glass fogged. Families who tried to outrace it by buggy or by truck found it closing like a door. In town after town, the chronology repeated. A hush, then grit on the teeth, then a roar, then a dark that moved. The first objects to fly were shingles and chicken coops, then entire roofs, then the boards those roofs had been nailed to. Telegraph lines went slack and then were gone, and with them the ability to warn what lay down the track. Doctors crawled from under splintered porches and turned parlors into clinics until the parlors were gone too. In Murfreesboro, a fire caught and ran with the wind. Survivors carried pumps and buckets toward a blaze that kept changing streets because the streets kept disappearing. Across the Wabash into Indiana, the funnel had already been tearing at the land for hours. Griffin was not much more than a cluster of buildings near the state line, but it had families and corners and smells. By evening, most of that was timber lined up in the road. Princeton watched barns drift through the air and come apart in a clatter you could feel in your ribs. Schools let out early where someone had a radio or a rumor, and still the black wall beat them to the crossroads. People who dove into ditches came up naked, their clothes stolen by the wind. People who stayed in houses sometimes rode those houses as they fell apart. From first touch to final lift, the tornado carved a track of roughly 219 miles across 3 states, Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana, in about 3.5 hours. The numbers came later, assembled from courthouse ledgers, and the memory of men who carried bodies to wagons. The figure that stuck was about 700 dead, with thousands injured and many towns ripped to foundations. It remains the deadliest tornado in U.S. history, not just for its rage, but for its endurance. A single long-track killer that did not hop and skip so much as plow. What makes a storm like that is half physics and half bad luck. The day was warm and unstable. A strong low and a jet streak provided shear and lift. The boundary layer fed energy like a bellows. But none of that explains what it felt like to lay your child in a root cellar and pull the door shut while the hinges shrieked. None of it explains the horses standing afterward with straw driven into their hides, or the way pine needles pinned themselves into fence posts as if nailed there. Stove lids flew like coins. A plank pierced a tree and stuck there for years, a monument in wood to invisible pressure. The systems that should have helped were small or missing. Forecasting in 1925 avoided the word tornado in public to prevent panic. Early warnings moved by telegraph and telephone where lines survived. Sirens were a future luxury. The Illinois Central and small, short lines carried doctors and clergymen toward smoke columns, but the rails were twisted and trestles gone. A Red Cross chapter formed triage stations in school basements that no longer had the rest of the school. Neighbors did most of the saving, men pulling at joists, women boiling rags, children leading the uninjured toward town squares that had turned into field hospitals. Night came on broken towns. Lanterns threw light over rows of bed frames dragged into the open, over the long tables where names were written and some were not. County seats lacked enough coffins. Carpenters made them in shifts by porch lamplight. A church bell rang without a steeple. In more than one place, the mayor's office relocated to a surviving boxcar because it had walls and a desk. Trains brought morphine and gauze and carried away the worst wounded when the tracks were cleared, and along the right-of-way people stood blinking, all the color washed out of them by dust and surprise. In the weeks after, stories hardened into lessons. Children learned which ditches held water and which held only shadow. Families rebuilt storm cellars deeper and lined them with brick. Telegraph companies restrung lines, and Weather Bureau men took measurements no one before had needed. Path width, forward speed, pressure fall. Engineers studied why certain brick buildings pancaked and why others, set just a little differently, remained. School boards spaced dismissal times to keep children from filling streets in a single vulnerable moment. A culture learned to look at the sky not for beauty, but for structure. Anvil, wall cloud, scud, hook. Stand today on the flatland outside Murfreesboro when the corn is short and the wind is restless. Imagine a mile of ground scoured to boards and clay, the smell of sap and coal smoke, the quick decisions about who can be carried and who must be covered. Imagine a horizon that moves. The tri-state tornado is a line on a map now, a record in a book, and a count of the dead. But it is also the echo of doors slamming in cellars and the long, low sound that made every other sound disappear. It ran until it was done, and when it lifted, the three states were stitched together by a single story. How a day that began with chores ended with landscapes rearranged. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.